What is the rarest type in every Pokemon generation? It's something that I've thought about a few times throughout my time as a Pokemon fan, especially when I'm adventuring through a new game and I notice a distinct lack of options in the Pokédex for a certain type. I'm looking at you, fire types in Sinnoh, but really this issue is far more pervasive than you would think. Often, Pokemon is able to hide it well, either by introducing a very memorable Pokemon for that typing, having a type specialist in the region making it work with the limited pool, and especially in the newer games, compensating by filling out the Pokédex with older Pokemon from past generations to have a pretty balanced dex overall. So today we will just be focusing on new Pokemon introduced in that generation or region, since those are the Pokemon that most people will want to use as they're brand new and native to the region. Along the way, we'll see if any types appear more than once, and other fun facts, like whether the generation compensates for the lack of new Pokemon with that particular typing through the methods that I mentioned above. Pouring through this kind of data and finding balance is a vital exercise in game design. And while I'm not designing a game of my own per se, I found writing this video tremendously useful as I work on the balance behind the Pokédex and the new designs that I'm making for a Fakemon region of my own, to be explored in a future video series. As I've mentioned in some other recent videos, I'm really excited to showcase this region, its Pokemon, and story in future videos. But while I continue to work on it behind the scenes, please consider joining my Patreon, because every dollar you put in it is directly being used to fund character commissions and the region map from talented artists all across the Pokemon community. This project is going to be well worth the wait, I can promise you that, but I do need your help to make it as good as it can be, so please check out the link below in the description. With that being said, let's delve into some Pokemon types. Generation 1, Kanto. As expected, this is the first and the only time that Pokemon was not able to incorporate Pokemon from past generations to help out with balancing the dex, since this is obviously the first generation. So what we see is what we've got. I will get the technicality out of the way. Dark, Steel, and Fairy type pulling up the rear here, with all three standing at 0 new Pokemon introduced at the time of Generation 1. That's obviously because none of these three types existed. A generation later, Dark and Steel were brought into existence, retyping a few Pokemon, and Generation 6 gave us the Fairy type, with a lot of retypings on the table. But don't expect me to mention this again until we get there, as I'm talking about the rarest type available at the time. So for the 15 types that are actually available here, it's a two-way tie between Dragon and Ghost. Both offer 3 Pokemon apiece from one single evolutionary family respectively. For Dragon, this type was essentially envisioned as an ultra-rare, almost legendary-like boss thing. The specialist here is Lance, and the last trainer you battle before the champion, coding him and his draconic team as the penultimate force in the Kanto region. The only way to get that one and only dragon is through acquiring Dratini or Dragonair. You'll either need to fish for them with a Super Rod in the Safari Zone, or buy them for thousands of coins in the Celadon Game Corner. Neither of these are small feats. They require a good amount of patience and effort compared to a wild encounter in a patch of grass. I also find it interesting that both of these locations kind of imply these Pokemon have been imported to the Kanto region and are only here because of that. It certainly adds to the air of mystery and the legendary status surrounding the type at the time. Ghost is very similar, and found only in the Gengar family. Even rarer technically than the dragons, since you can only find Ghastly and Haunter in one single location, the Pokemon Tower. Like dragons, this kind of makes it so this is less of a typing category and more of just a single character designation. These are the ghosts of Kanto, to be considered supernatural and rare just like a mythical dragon. However, they are pretty common in their one home. Ghastly, with a 90 to 95% encounter rate, is essentially the only Pokemon that you're going to be encountering here, making them a staple of their environment rather than a rarity that could be missed. Plus, they're even more normalized with Agatha serving as a member of the Elite Four as well, giving you 3 looks at the typing through the one family throughout your battle with her, which is actually kind of funny because it's more of a poison specialty battle looking back, but I digress. It's insane to me how Generation 1 gave us 2 types of equally extreme rarity through only one family each. That is something that I'm sure that we'll never see again in the franchise. Now onto Generation 2. And it kind of doubles down on the exact same thing. The rarest types here again are Ghost and Dragon, offering us not one evolutionary family each, but this time one Pokemon each. Looking back, Generation 2 is not acclaimed for its Pokédex balance, essentially serving as a direct sequel or expansion pack to Generation 1 at the time, but still. Dragon gives us Kingdra, an evolution to a prior Pokemon from Generation 1, and Ghost gives us Misdreavus, an original Pokemon that is exclusively found in Mount Silver Cave, which you can't access until the endgame of the post-game. So these types are very exclusive and still meant to be seen as rare. We even get this lore-wise with the Dragon's Den, which is kind of treated as a sacred site for only powerful trainers in the region. Though Generation 2 does once again compensate for rarity by having these types represented through specialists, now gym leaders. We have Claire the Dragon Trainer, who does use a Kingdra as her signature Pokemon, and we have Morty the Ghost Trainer, who does not use a Misdreavus, instead opting for a team like Agatha's, full of Gengar relatives. Man, they do not like you, do they? Will Pokemon continue this trend of Ghost and Dragon types as the two staple rare types? We'll see as we continue with Generation 3. This generation is the first that feels normal, in a sense, with the rarest types still pretty represented. Finishing in last tier alone is the Electric type, a type with just 4 entries. We've got 3, but basically 2 evolutionary lines on hand with Electrike, Manectric, and the 2 cheerleader twins in Plusle and Minun. However, despite the lack of variety, the game does not at all treat this type like something special. Collectively, Electrike, Plusle, and Minun make up 45% of all the encounters in Route 110, the famous Paralysis route in Hoenn. And just north of that, you will find Mauville City's Watson, the Electric-type gym leader. So for the 3rd consecutive generation, we see that the rarest type is well represented with a gym specialist, but it is worth noting that Watson's team varies quite a bit in his debut generation. If you battle him in Ruby and Sapphire, the base games, he strangely does not use any of the new Pokemon, instead opting for a team that would make Lieutenant Surge proud. Gen 4 is next, and you already know what to expect. It's been a subject of ridicule for years. Fire is the least abundant type in the Sinnoh region. Really, it's the lack of dex balancing elsewhere, like the inclusion of appropriate older Pokemon that I mentioned earlier, that really makes it hurt in Sinnoh, because I was surprised that the total number of new fire types here is actually higher than Hoenn's new electric types, with 5. You've got the starting family of Chimchar and company, of course, Magmortar, and Heatran. Rotom Heat does not count, as it, alongside its appliance brethren, was not retyped with a secondary type until Generation 5, despite debuting in Platinum. That's something I didn't know until very recently. Another thing that I think contributes to the mockery of fire types in Sinnoh is the fact that none of these Pokemon are quote-unquote normal. Unlike Ghastly or Electrike, these are not standard encounters on your adventure. If you pick Turtwig or Piplup, you miss out on 3 of the 5 offerings. One of the other 2 is a rare legendary Pokemon found only in the postgame with little lore associated with it. The other is an evolution to a prior Pokemon just like Kingdra, and it's not even available unless you're playing Pokemon Platinum. Even if you are, it's pretty hard to evolve, as it's an obscure item and a trait evolution. Sure, there is a type specialist here again in Flint, the Elite Four member, but it almost adds insult to injury when you look at his team in the base games. This is not flattering. So if you're playing Pokemon Diamond or Pearl and you don't pick Chimchar, you'd better really like Ponyta. Now on to Generation 5. Similar to Kanto, we have our first blank slate in a while, as this generation chose to give us a Pokédex of entirely new Pokemon. Plus, with a total pool of 156 and 4 generations of experience in game balance, this is bound to have less weird rarity, right? The answer to that is yes, with Poison type being our lowest total with a whopping 7. This is something that I don't think is noticeable at all, and it isn't really that low comparatively. For reference, Rock had 8, Ghost had 9, and Ice had 10. Just to give you a point of reference for the balance that is on hand here. You've got 3 families, the Venipede duo, the Trubbish duo, and the Fungus duo. All of these are very abundant encounters throughout the fields and forests of Unova, all serving as perfectly middle-of-the-road staple Pokemon, in my opinion, to round out this new dex. Plus, Black and White 2 gave us Roxy, who specializes in the Poison type and uses a Whirlipede of her own. So this goes to show just how thoughtfully balanced the Unova dex is. Poison being the answer here is not a testament to its rarity, but simply because some type had to have the lowest total of new designs. Generation 1 gave us over 30 and was the most abundant type there, so if anything, this makes total sense for Unova and balances the overall scales of it. Now we move to Kalos, which kind of has the opposite thing going for it with only 72 new Pokemon introduced. So whatever type comes in last has to be really low, right? That does seem to be the case, with the winner, or loser I guess, here being the poison type once again, with only one family in Skrelp and Dragology, so 2 Pokemon total. This actually does make sense to me given that by this point, new Pokemon come secondary in the dex balance to proper distribution of older Pokemon. Again, a dex of 72 had to have someone come in dead last. However, I'm a bit shocked that Kalos doesn't do more to compensate for this. Dragology is actually a version exclusive Pokemon to Pokemon Y, so if you played X and you were pumped to try out the original poison types, you were completely out of luck, without trading of course. Kalos also doesn't have a poison type specialist, marking the first time in this study the rarest type of the generation does not have a type specialist to make up for it. Though with literally one family to choose from, how much could you specialize in that type really? Moving on to Generation 7, we see a new type coming up last, with Ice only giving us 5 Pokemon once again. For the tropical Alola region, I suppose a lack of Ice types does make sense, though I am surprised that such a relatively rare, late game, and competitively horrible type such as Ice wasn't an answer before now. Looking at this pool, we've only got one regular Pokemon so to speak, with Crabominable, which is pretty common when you consider that Crabrawler is found all across Alola, and all you need to do is take it to the only snowy location in the game. Pretty straightforward stuff. The other 4 here come from the first ever pool of regional variants, and are also pretty common, though version exclusive, so you'll really only get 3 ice types depending on the version that you're playing. Is it fair that I counted these Pokemon towards the total and not the Mega Evolutions in Generation 6? I think so, given that the regional forms are permanent Pokemon, not temporary form changes, and also change the Pokemon's type as a requisite to be considered a regional form, whereas Megas only do occasionally. Let me know what you think. Wrapping up things with Generation 8, we're going to just count Galar, as Hisui only introduces regional forms and evolutions to build upon the balance of Sinnoh, not create balance of its own. So looking just at Galar, that gives us a 2-way tie between ground and bug type, with 2 new entries in this study. Honestly, not something I expected, as these types never seem to have trouble representing themselves. Ground gives us only 2 original Pokemon in the Sandaconda line, plus regional Yamask, its evolution Runerigus, and regional Stunfisk. So, a pretty good pool. Despite Runerigus' impossibly complicated evolution method, all of these Pokemon are very common, and well featured in Galar, with Sandaconda even getting a Gigantamax form of its own. Meanwhile, Bug gives us 2 families with Centiskorch and Orbeetle. Both of these Pokemon do have nice representation as common, staple bugs in Galar, and they each get a Gigantamax form. Centiskorch even serving as the signature Pokemon for the Fire Gym leader Kabu. Despite this is a very small pool, and alongside Ground, neither of these 2 types have specialists in Galar. This is the only time 2 types tie for rarity and neither have a specialist. But because of the nice abundance of these Pokemon and highlights in other ways, plus the fact that this dex is massive when you count the DLCs, and well balanced in plenty of other ways just like Generation 6, I feel like these types being rare isn't nearly as noticeable as some of the other ones that we've discussed today. And finally, we arrive at Generation 9. Given the trend of increasing balance that we've seen, I should have seen this coming, but I was still very surprised. Of all the generations we've gone over today, Paldea blows them all out of the water. We've got a tie here, with Ice, Bug, and Rock types all having a generous 7 Pokemon each. Looking at these pools once again, it really doesn't reveal anything interesting either. Ice is perhaps the most elusive, with 1 pseudo-legendary family, 1 legendary, and 1 paradox, but also Satitan's Duo, which was the Ice Gym leader Grusha's signature Pokemon. You certainly won't have any trouble finding Rock types either, or even Bug types, who does have a gym of its own very early on. This seems like yet another example of certain types just having to arbitrarily have the lowest count by chance, nothing that really denotes their rarity. And with that, we have reached the end. When I began this process, I was sure that certain types consistently maintained rare status throughout the generations, like Ghost, Dragon, Ice, or even Fire types. But what I instead found along the way was a wide mix of types, and some I didn't expect. But what do you think? Are there any types that you feel particularly hard to come by in certain Pokemon games? especially from these counts or something else? Let me know down below. Thank you to all my patrons, especially Guardian Patron and Wynne. Again, I thank everyone for their support as progress marches on with my Fakemon region. Please consider joining on Patreon, linked below, to help make the region's map commission as great as can be, alongside things like voice acting, character commissions, and more that will make this series one of a kind. I can't express my appreciation for your support enough. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time for more content.